We're going to talk about ways that selectors can interact with each other. And that's because maybe we want to start doing some more complicated things. And rather than doing a bunch of IDs or classes that are very, very specific, we can combine selectors in clever ways instead. So jumping into that, the first thing I want to point out before we get into how we combine them is specificity. So if multiple styles would apply to a given HTML element, the browser applies the most specific selector that it has available. So from least specific to most specific, we have type, then we have class, then we have ID. So let me write just a real quick example of this. We might have a paragraph that has class equals, let's call it description. And it has ID equal to definition. So then in your CSS file, and there's going to be all sorts of stuff in here. In your CSS file, if you define only a P, so only the paragraph is the only thing that has a style applied to it, then this will get whatever styling is you have for a P. If you define P and the class, so you've got one thing where it's like P and then the P style, and then you've got dot description. And the description code, then the code, any duplicates, the description code will change the format of this. And likewise, if you have definition, or if you have the ID definition specifically defined, anything in here will overwrite the others. So what you can think about is, if you find it easier, first it'll go through and it'll set all the formatting based on P, then it will change anything based on what is defined for description, and then it will change everything based on what's defined for definition. And so this is useful because we can kind of layer things and do kind of organizing around this. But just be aware that this also means if you want all of your paragraphs to show up exactly the same, you need to make sure you don't override that with a class or an ID somewhere else in your CSS. Chaining is another thing we can do. This lets you specify 2 or more selectors that you want to have both need to be true in order for this to apply to the CSS only applies to places where both selectors or all 3 selectors or all 4 selectors are present. And we do this by putting a period between the selectors. So an example of this would be p.news. So this would say only things that are both paragraph and have the class news would be selected to have whatever CSS code you put in here. So if it was just a paragraph, this wouldn't apply. If it's just news, it wouldn't apply. If it's paragraph and news, it would apply. Descendant combinator is very similar but slightly different. This lets you specify selectors that are children of another selector by putting a space between selectors. So if, for example, I have news space h1, then this would say if I have a section like a div where div class equals news, and then inside that section I've got an H1, then this H1 would get whatever CSS code I have. But if I have an H1 outside of it, even if this also has class equals news, this one would not get it because we need to have it be a child of the news section. So if there's something that has a category or whatever this first selector applies, only embedded elements with the second and or third and or fourth selector have this apply. And then lastly, just a couple other miscellaneous bits. If you have chaining and descendant combinators, those are more specific than their non-chained or non-descendant counterparts. So in that first example where we had p.news, that's going to be more specific than just p. So if there was a paragraph setting, the p.news would override any paragraph settings. And this kind of should intuitively make sense, I think. And if you want to apply the same style to multiple selectors, use a comma between selectors. So for example, if I want paragraph, H1, and H3 to all have the same style, CSS style, I can do it like this. I can try P, comma, H1, comma, H3, and stuff like this. If I don't have this comma, remember it becomes a descendant. So if I said P space H1, then that would mean that only the H1s that are nested within a paragraph get that styling. Whereas this says, regardless of where the P is, regardless of where the H1 is, regardless of the H3 is, set them all to have the same style. These miscellaneous rules will take some getting used to. That's where I'll give you feedback and help out with that. But I just want to kind of introduce it, and then as you go through the practice exercises, it should help kind of clarify and bring things into focus.